Chapter In the Dome Again. Handing a few coins to a couple gnomes for returning his horse and cart back to the entrance, Spliff had the memory feeling for why he left. The caring was coming back, and it made him feel like he might do something terrible. In gnomish culture, pride rested on what one had done, what they had mined, what they had forged. Spliff felt very strongly one should feel much prouder of what they had not done, of exhausting the illusion between pride and accomplishment. Unfortunately, no such pride has been invented, or at least no word for it has. The two of them had been silent for most of the ride back up the mountain. In the back of his mind, Francis was already thinking he would stay one more night, grab his pack, and return to wandering, though he was also surprised by the amount of resistance he had to this impulse. Was one drunken night of highfalutin conversation enough to make him sentimental? Yes, obviously. Maybe friendship, like love, was a miracle. It was a moment which had not happened for Francis very often. The walk back to their apartments felt long. Spliff was trying to hurry because he'd promised to show up for dinner, and he didn't want to give the impression he was avoiding doing so. He still had faith in his sister. Maybe what he had to do was keep up the game about how much he didn't care. He didn't want to care anyway. Haida and Keppa got their wealth on the back of his research. So what? He was happy for them. He'd been out in the world. He was friends with a bumbling druid. He wasn't a threat. Maybe give him a little stipend and he'd disappear again. It was a long day of walking, and Francis had no interest in going to a formal dinner. He pestered Spliff for a coin to buy some type of egg roll-up with mushroom from one of the market vendors. The food was very good, seasoned with spices he couldn't pinpoint, and Francis thought this was, perhaps, at least, one more reason to stay for a while longer. It was important for him to know spice names. Chapter Pofime. She came to his door in the night like she had known Francis was not sleeping. The knock on the door was quiet. When Francis opened the door, he could hardly make out her face in the dark, but the nightgown she was wearing seemed to be illuminated, as if the silk the gown was weaved from had captured the essence of moonlight. She asked if he would like to join her for a nightcap. He drifted after her as if following an apparition. Francis didn't know why he agreed to follow. But in what book do they teach a man to resist a seductive woman in a glowing gown asking you to follow her? Where or how would one learn such a skill? Instead of walking upstairs to the entrance, Pofime pushed a panel in one of the walls and they descended again. They walked through a short, unrefined hallway and came out through another panel. "You can use this way again if you like," she said as she shut the panel behind him. "It's an open secret." In this hall, the walls had been frescoed. They were scenes of forest painted three-dimensionally. They really did give the impression of being outside, and Francis's attention was divided as he tried looking for details like insects or mushrooms. Then she had stopped and was opening a more formal and heavy wood door. She held out her arm for him to enter first, and so he did. A small female gnome was arranging a platter by a drink stand, and Pofime dismissed her for the evening. The gnome shut the big door behind her with some effort. "I was thinking some rosehip and chamomile tea with a splash of sherry and some cultured cream. Does that sound agreeable?" She went over to the platter where 2 cups were already gently steaming. She opened a small jar and swirled in a small spoonful of cream into both. She wasn't really asking then, Francis noticed. But he also didn't mind. It sounded pleasant. She came back and handed him a cup and let him take in the room for a moment while she reclined on a chaise lounge. There was a couch across from her which seemed to be his expected sitting place. First, Francis couldn't help but reflect how in one day he had seen so many individual and intimate rooms. He had gone years only seeing the insides of taverns and tavern rooms. He wasn't sure what to make of deciphering what a room said about the individual, if a room was trying to say anything at all. The first detail he noticed was how large and open the room was. On one side was an oversized bathtub with stacks of books next to it, and a shelf of powders within grasp of the tub. One large bookshelf took up the wall next to the tub, and Frances gravitated towards it like a bee to pollen. One shelf seemed to be dedicated to a row of very informally bound texts, sewn together with twine instead of bound to a spine. Frances picked one of these at random from the middle and started to leaf through. "Those are my students' works. Every year I ask each of them to write me their life story. I make them do the sewing," Pofime said, still on the couch, sipping her tea with both hands. This had the desired and accurate effect of curbing Frances's interest. He was not going to casually leaf through a life story. The suggestion of students made Frances wonder if she was older than she looked. He put the text back and turned to her, catching her gaze and scrutinizing her appearance for the first time. She had her knees together and the nightgown rolled over the full length of her legs, so the only skin he could see was a wisp of ankle before her slippers and the window of chest between both clavicles. Her face did not seem to have any pronounced wrinkles. Frances would have guessed them around the same age, which made him reflective. Had he been frittering his life away? He had no discernible accomplishments, let alone enough students to fill a small section of bookshelf. She invited him to sit, which he did. He finally took a sip of the tea, and it was lovely. He took a much bigger drink. "Do you know much about magic, Master Druid?" Pofime asked. "I know enough to know I don't know much," Frances said. "Very clever. That is often the problem, isn't it? One wants to know so badly they forget to examine why they wanted to know in the first place. Unfortunately, I have no such luxury. I know exactly how much others don't know, so I'll ask again, just to give me a baseline, what I'm working with." "Well," Frances began after some hesitation, "I'd say you're using some of it on me right now. There's a reason incantations use words. If you can get someone in full armor to still feel they're vulnerable to your words, what could be more powerful?" "This is true, very true, so you're no beginner." She drank down her tea and stood up for another. She approached Frances and held out her hand for his cup. He drank the rest of his and handed it to her. She forgot about the tea and poured straight sherry in the cups. She told him it helped her sleep. Instead of returning to her reclined position on her couch, she sat upright, facing him head on. "But why do words work?" she asked. "I'm not sure I understand the question," Frances said. "What is a word manipulating?" "I suppose one is implanting a suggestion which the listener now has to engage with, unless they've put up a defense or anger or rage or perhaps melancholy." Frances's voice drifted off as he thought of other ways one could try to fend off words. "Stupidity," Frances continued after a moment. "No," Pofime disagreed. "The feeble-minded are just as able to be influenced, if not more so. Though I will say, I've never thought of melancholy as being a defensive tactic before. It would explain at least one ex's ability to tolerate me." She smiled, her thin lips revealing short teeth. "But let's go even deeper," she continued. "What specifically does a word manipulate?" "This sounds like a riddle," Frances said. "Another form of magic," Pofime joked. Now she waited for him. He drank anxiously from his cup of sherry. Frances admitted he didn't know. "Do you understand how they combine metals here?" "Heat, and then a hammer is involved," Frances said. "So heat and pressure," Pofime said. "Yes, sure," Frances responded. "But why does heat and pressure work for metals and not, say, trees or water?" Pofime said. "Well, I hate to state the obvious," Frances said. "Is it so obvious?" she asked with a tilt of her head. "Obviously it has to do with what they are made out of, the primal elements." "But what are those elements?" Pofime asked. "They're different. Air, fire, earth. Are different words not made of essentially the same sounds? Water doesn't quench fire because they are different. Earth can also quench fire. If they were so very different, water would do nothing to fire. They would pass through each other. Water quenches fire because there is something about them which is the same, a variation of that sameness." "If fire and water are no different, I don't understand what the word difference means," Frances said. "Ah, yes. I say that to my students. Forget about differences. Think of it this way. How could fire be put out by water unless it wanted to be put out? Maybe it makes no sense to give fire a desire in human terms, but it's true fire has its own terms for desire, Pofime said. Francis finished off his sherry, hoping it would give him a spurt of energy. Pofime told him to help himself to more if he wanted. Why not? He got up and poured himself a half cup. What was the original question? Francis asked. Pofime smiled, looking up towards the ceiling. Let's just simplify, and I'll tell you something I know to be true. Words are like metals, and magic manipulates both in the same way. And how is that? Francis asked, putting his teacup of sherry next to him on the couch and folding his arms over his lap. Ionic attraction. She sat with these words hanging in the air. I don't follow, Francis finally said. She held out her cup to him, asking for a refill. Francis took the cup and poured it half full and handed it back to her. Pofime thanked him and immediately stood up. I found my students really connected with hearing it explained this way. She moved behind the couch and waited for Francis to find a comfortable seated position. The word love. You even used this word last night when we met for the first time. She pointed in the direction of the hall, presumably. Francis wondered about this move of hers to get behind the furniture. It added a level of distance which made him feel like she was about to impart knowledge. Perhaps that's why his mentor Melilyn had always felt so distant with him. The way to pass things along was if the mind felt removed or above. She had said something and he missed it. He apologized and asked her to repeat what she said. What we call love is simply time. They are no different. People want the best colors, the best tastes, everything good life has to offer. Love. What makes things good? Time. What makes a flower beautiful? Its occasion in the flow of time. This sherry, Pofime raised her cup, made delicious through time. She took a sip. Magic is knowing attraction is time. Time is love. And what do words do? They manipulate time. Pofime smiled knowingly, looking at Francis's face. It is usually at this juncture where I give an example. And for you I have something special, something better than my students ever got. She walked to a table behind her and opened something with a tinkle, blocked from Francis's view by her back. She drained her cup of sherry, quickly knocking back her head, and she stayed with her back turned for a moment. When she turned around, she was still only holding the cup, but she began walking towards him. We have spent a small amount of time together, but let us say we met every night for a week. Nothing but words and time. Even if it was barely perceptible, would you not feel closer to me? Perhaps, even, let us pretend you disagreed with every word I said. She again flashed her short-toothed smile and walked ever closer. I know you would still feel closer, and you would know it too, and that is magic, helped along with a little pinch of beauty as time. Pofime stuck her fingers into the teacup and removed a pinch of something. She was right in front of him now, and she asked him to raise his cup, and he did so. She dropped the pinch into the sherry in his cup and stirred it with her finger. Then she licked her finger seductively and bade him drink. Francis had yet to back down from an ingestion and wasn't going to start now. He tilted the cup into his lips and slurped comically. Almost immediately he could feel a tickle in his brain, like a streak of lightning flashed over the top of his skull. And time felt like it flashed forward and froze simultaneously. He saw a whole life together with Pofime. He felt grief at her death, which deepened everything they had gone through together. The word meaning became not just a word, but a feeling which encompassed everything, and everything was too meager a word for the feeling. He understood grief as reconciliation with the past and the future as the full possibility of love. He felt like he really knew her, and pronouns were too unlike the essence of understanding to explain how well he understood her. Her, an entity both inside and outside of time. He was so grateful to have seen even the tiniest glimpse of her, and yet in that glimpse was the whole picture, the whole world of self. He didn't need to know anything else for the rest of his existence. She sat next to him and cradled his head and gently encouraged him to lay his head in her lap. She ran her fingers through his hair. Slowly, time resumed, to the heartbeat rhythm of the present. But Francis stayed laying for a while, his head in her lap, the fingers running over his scalp, and the tickle of her touch making his whole body buzz. Later, she encouraged him to stand and walked him to the door. She was tired and was going to rest. He should do the same. Offhandedly, she asked what he knew about Spliff's project. Francis told her everything, like he would have to a friend he'd known his whole life. "Good night, Master Druid," she said, as she smiled and closed the door. As soon as the door closed, Francis staggered backwards and fell to the floor and started crying, quietly, as to not let her know. It felt like losing her all over again, but they were, in a way, happy tears. Happy he'd ever been able to know her at all. Chapter Falsior. It will unlikely surprise to hear the man known as the Great Wizard Falsior was not born with that name. Here is an allegory to understand his personality. He was like a presentation main course at a festival, which is some meat stuffed inside another meat stuffed inside another meat, and which tastes like none of them and worse than all of them. A quail stuffed inside a chicken, stuffed inside a duck stuffed inside a turkey. It sounds impressive when accompanied by a speech from the chef. The idea of him seemed impressive, and he was aware talking had done him a great deal of service, and he owed the world something in return for the luck he had been given. Or he had been aware. Now he was near the tipping point of believing he'd been the whole world all along, and his gratitude had been misplaced, when really he should do whatever he liked and know it would be correct. As one of Pofime's first students, and an old one at that, he bloomed into his powers after an extended adolescence of wastefulness, where he played with the family money by drinking and whoring. As one of her first students, back then she went by Mademoiselle Qualia Sutcliffe, they had explored together the realm of words, how speech itself could cast a spell. Later, he'd encouraged her to keep this secret to herself. She didn't listen, but he encouraged it. He followed the obvious path, using his newfound skills in games of chance, not only for the money, also because games of chance played at high levels attracted the right kinds of people with power. It was at such a game where his destiny finally found its purchase. The game was Warships, a game of 5 dice rolled under a cup. The player lifted up their cup, for their own eyes first, and bet the damage they would do to an opponent's warship. After each round, players removed a die. The removed die then became a sea and wind roll, affecting the accuracy of one's damage. The primary component of the game was bluffing, and it was a gentleman's game. Rowdy, drunken laborers would have found it too banal or become too emotional to hold the nuance necessary for the finer complications of wind rolls, or to have the restraint to know even one blow of damage in a round where you took none could be considered a very fine victory indeed. At least this was Bragadine's estimation, now known as the Great Wizard Falsior. Justification for the inherent childishness in games. But he often wondered if the whole world wasn't one big game. The more he played them, the more convinced he became. Rules and luck, but if you knew how to bluff and really knew what your opponent considered as strengths, there was no reason one should lose. Or, if the whole world's a game, the only goal is to be a winner. One of his tricks was to lose in an early round and put his opponent off their guard. On this occasion it didn't work. The king's advisor was shrewd, seemed to only care about the numbers. He spoke when he joined the table, his personal bodyguard taking a close seat on a stool nearby. The advisor proclaimed without any levity, 3 days in a row I've taken the exact same shit, the same density, the same size, even the way it lay in the bowl was the same. No one laughed because the delivery came from a place of fascination about dimensions. This was a very different type of opponent, and Bragadine appreciated the challenge. The real challenge, in this case, to get information related to the seat of power in the country. This would be a long game, far longer than any other he'd played. First, he deduced he must lose interestingly. Put up a real fight so he'd be a challenging opponent, but not good enough for the advisor to ever feel bad in his presence, like a loser. Second, he needed to find a way to get him back to the game. Bragadin had seen the advisor's eye wander towards one of the serving girls. He quickly made deals to establish a zone of discretion and encouraged the wench, with heaps of coin he never regretted spending, despite her smirking bribery, to pretend to fall in love with the advisor. Much of the fawning the girl did was too performative and went over this advisor's head, but it still created an environment related to pleasant feelings. And each nugget of information was a precious stone he was able to place on the mantle in the front of his mind. The crown jewel, so to speak, was the advisor's belief that there was no such thing as too much exposure. Someone will always hate you, but then someone else will love you simply because they hate the person who hates you. Bragadin took this advice in his show On the Road, running a tournament of games in towns and cities all across the country, perfecting another talent he'd picked up from the advisor, which he called the blame, shift, and shuffle. It was on such a day, in his office tent, Bragadin organizing the notes of who was doing what, and who would take the blame if X, Y, or Z went wrong, that the next moment in his destiny took place. A man who called himself his partner, and Bragadin allowed this relationship knowing no man was his equal, so what difference did it make what title they gave themselves? His partner had played a game of cards with a gnome from the mountain nearby. The gnome said he had a proposition for the leader of this gang, and having heard about the mountain, Bragadin was curious to get more information. The dome in the mountain, which attracted a bounty of traveling merchants, sounded like a fabulous place to make coin. He agreed to a meeting with the gnome. The guard told him a gnome named Kepo was here to see him. After introductions and an offer of a glass of fresh spring water Bragadin kept in a metallic vessel encased with wool so it kept its coolness until late afternoon, Bragadin leaned against his desk while the gnome's legs dangled from a chair. The gnome named Kepo was coy at first. Finally, Bragadin pressured him on what exactly he was trying to get at. "I figure you're the kind of human interested in this sort of thing. I bet you'd find all kinds of different buyers." Kepo removed a small chunk of rock from a hemp pouch and held it in his palm. It didn't make much of an impression on its own, so Kepo went on to explain how the rock contained lightning. "Let's say I believe you," Bragadin said, arms crossed over his chest. "Why bring this to me? From what I know of you gnomes, you don't trust outsiders." "This is special rock," Kepo had been rehearsing for this moment. "It's hard to come by." He felt proud of the gravitas on his face. "So, what do I do with it?" Bragadin asked. "Well, it sort of explodes, right? So you get a magician, or maybe it could be a weapon, really scare off your enemies." The gravitas left his face quickly and became a series of frowns. Had Kepo really not considered what someone might actually do with it? It was powerful. That was enough, wasn't it? Bragadin stared down the gnome. If this was some kind of trick, he wasn't sure which type it was. Gnomes were a very clever species. He stayed silent for a long time, running through all the different scenarios in his mind. If it was a scam, it was a very nuanced one. Obviously, no one was going to straight out believe a rock was magic. Bragadin asked for a demonstration. Yes, Kepo faltered. All that practice did nothing for his nerves in the moment. He really didn't want all so much. Extra coin to start a family. That is the other problem. I can't actually do anything with it, but I've seen it happen, Kepo exclaimed. He then jumped down and quickly went through his bag and brought out Spliff's notebooks. Bragadin was impressed by the notebooks, even though he could barely make sense of them. He was educated enough to know the words and symbols weren't simply gibberish designed to trick him, but he would need some kind of second opinion to understand. Bragadin went to his chest and found a small sack of coin, a hefty price for a rock which was probably worth nothing, but he was feeling generous, and there was something about the gnome's demeanor which he found profoundly sincere. He told Kepo he would need the rock in the notebooks and an address to write for him. "Of course I will return the notebooks in 6 months, regardless, and you may keep all that coin." It was his first meeting in earnest where anything had been offered. His acquaintance, who had an uncle on the Council of Gnomes, looked at Kepo like he was crazy, and Kepo agreed heartily. That amount of coin was a year's wages. Even if he sat on his hands for 6 months, he'd still have made metal, and he could always harvest another bit of rock. Keppo left the tent happy. Bragadin composed a letter to his teacher asking for her help. He found a willing courier and sent them off with the letter, the rock, and the notebooks. For a month he didn't think much of the interaction. It wasn't until he got a return letter which read, "Brago, I'm coming to you. Need to harvest fruits of labor here, but shall be done shortly. We need more of that rock. Think of something. Q." Bragadin, in turn, wrote a letter summoning the gnome. Keppo showed up with 3 more chunks, which, at first, Bragadin thought would be plenty. But when Qualia finally arrived with her giant wagon of unctures and tinctures and furniture, it took Bragadin a week to get over how much furniture she brought with her, she declared straight away she needed much, much more. Keppo was excited to be in the brainstorming sessions with these 2 powerful humans. It made him feel like the special qualities which made him Keppo were finally clear and evident. Though perhaps the entirety of his genius, and the moment which earned him his place of status in their eyes, was the day he brought up a single name. Falsior, and his place in gnomish history. Keppo gave them a history lesson about Falsior, what he could remember. Immediately Bragadin understood there was a sentiment inside that name which he could manipulate. The first distraction from their plan happened when they were visited by an emissary of the king. The elegant emissary insisted the king know precisely what they were up to. As it turned out, the courier whom Bragadin had sent with the notebooks had been enticed and paid by Bragadin's partner to bring this information to multiple sources, finally working his way up to the king. The king, upon seeing Qualia's exit from the city, decided her actions were more than enough proof the concept had validity. The king wanted a cut. Ultimately, through deals and the blame shift shuffle, the arrangement would be beneficial for both parties. The king agreed to finance the endeavor for a cut of the ore. The extra financing allowed the newly christened Falsior to balloon out his vision and enter Ionata with a bang. The plan took nearly 3 months to develop, but by the time they were walking through the streets of Little Iona, there was no doubt in their hearts the plan wouldn't succeed. They'd spread rumors about Falsior's arrival. A group of gnomes, including a few from the council, gathered at the entrance to the mountain. With precision timing, in the middle of the speech, where he called to the heavens to show him their favor, a crack echoed off the mountain. Falsior declared he came bearing gifts. He was going to return gnomes to their rightful place as leaders of the future. He put his finger to a lamp, subtly sprinkling a pinch of ethereumite between 2 pieces of magnetized ore, and the lamp lit up, brighter than flame. Later, in negotiations with the Council of Gnomes, he said his only request was to be granted access to the mines for some tertiary metals to channel the ions. He explained how a lightning bolt was like a river and needed to be focused to be captured. "Surely you must have 1 shaft you could spare," Falsior protested, with the perfect naivete of benevolence. Chapter: The Anniversary Dinner. Francis woke the next day after sleeping both poorly and long. He'd had many impressions during the night. Vague reminiscences which clung to the back of his eyeballs. Upon waking, he felt confused where he even was, his sense of spatial reality warped through time. Only because of previous experience from disoriented and drug-induced states was he able to calm his anxiety and prevent a full-blown panic attack. He took big breaths and huffed fiercely out his nose on the exhales. How to characterize what had happened the previous night? He could find no sense of ill will other than how terrible his body felt at the moment, and the quickest way he could conceive to calm the disturbances of his mind would be to find Pofime again, to have her touch him, stroke his hair, or touch his cheek. Francis sat with this feeling for a long time. Sitting with it helped him acknowledge the feeling as passing through him. In its place, another question was bubbling up. How to tell the truth? He didn't want to harm Pofime in any way, yet he was surprised how strongly he felt a need to talk to Spliff. He must warn him. tell him if there was any doubt about whether the others knew about his research. Such a doubt was gone. In a way, maybe even, Spliff would be pleased. Francis enjoyed the removal of ambiguity. Personally, maybe Spliff would like it too. Francis rolled his eyes at himself and his own justifications. The removal of one ambiguity only brought to light a larger, more difficult ambiguity. What to do next? He uncrossed his legs. Enough thinking. He knocked on the door to Spliff's room. No answer. He wasn't sure he had the mental stamina to puzzle out where Spliff would have gone. They hadn't been in Ionata long enough for routines to develop. Francis wasn't even sure what he'd do with his own time. He was hungry. Maybe if he tried to find food, he'd find Spliff. He walked up the staircase and towards the door for the street, thinking about his limitations. What he needed, spiritually, to get back to himself was again seeing the world as limitless. His indulgence in the world and exercise in freedom. That's when he was most confident. Out in nature, in the entire existence of plants bubbling like a cauldron, he only needed to sniff and be refreshed. Oh, to be out of the city and with Pofime, making love in a field of downy grasses. Francis opened the door to outside, and a blast of noise flew up through his nostrils, a beautiful concussion. A band in the parade had chosen that exact moment right outside the door to blow a tremendous wonk through their brass horns. Gnomes and a scattering of human merchants on the sides of the parade cheered and applauded. Some joined in the parade and danced with the band. Francis was immediately overwhelmed. The parade seemed to be quite small, with the crowd moving along with the band. Francis waited for another moment on the steps, then followed behind. A couple gnome children danced erratically next to him, and then finally seeing his face and beard, stopped dancing to stare. Francis wiggled his hips, and the kids giggled and blew raspberries at him, and Francis continued to dance his way back up to the gates of the main house, surrounded by hoots and hollers, and he felt somewhat renewed. He'd be even more exhausted when he stopped. Maybe he should keep dancing with the parade and hope Spliff would find him? His head started pounding, which was enough to put the kibosh on that idea. The guard at the door to the palace wasn't the right word, estate or labyrinth, maybe? The guard said nothing as Francis entered. The vibe was similar to the day they had arrived. Guests in fancy dress milling about and drinking. He tried to wander away from the people and walked into the rock garden. He saw Grail standing with a group of guards. He was dressed the same as the guards and had a thin sword on his hip. He had a small glass in one hand and smiled when he saw the bearded Druid. "You're still here," Grail barked, his words already in accusation, the guard dog logic of the soldier. "Yes," Francis was almost stammering. He needed to speak to get lots of things clear, but he didn't know where to begin, so he stopped speaking. Grail took pity on the Druid. It was going the way he'd predicted for him. Confusion and need to run back to his spindly forests. Still, the Druid had been kind to him on the road. He could have one reciprocal moment of kindness. Turn around. Second staircase to the right, the one which looks like an L. Francis felt it had been very kind of Grail to realize he was lost, but it also made him question how Grail had found his bearings so quickly. Maybe he was the problem. His troubles in the world because he didn't understand something fundamental. Troubles? Did he have troubles? Francis's emotions were grasping at the ends of himself. The good times he called his personality. God, maybe he did need to leave. Or maybe Pofime would hold him again. Francis was winded at the top of these stairs. He walked into the room, hugging the side railing, and shared a moment of huffing and puffing with a gnome who was putting hand over hand on a rope, pulling up a tray of food on a pulley. Francis really did feel the worse for wear. Thoughts came, but they trudged through his brain like a mule in thick mud. At first he wasn't sure if the scene in front of him was real. The dining setup looked like the tables he'd read about in books. A horseshoe of tables meshed together. The head table, staring down new entrance, featured the familiar cadre, Valsior in the middle, Kepo on his left with his family, and Pofime on his far right, near the end, with a few gnomes in between Francis didn't recognize. Pofime stood and smiled and motioned to the Druid when she noticed him. The beckoning gesture felt simultaneously very flattering and like a command he couldn't resist. It seemed as though Pofime had saved him a spot at the end of the long table, which connected to the shorter head table. Francis tried not to look at her too long or deeply, and thus when he sat, he looked straight ahead into the eyes of Spliff, sat exactly opposite. A gulf of empty space between them and the words which needed to be spoken. Spliff, too, had a rough morning. He had awoken with a feeling he could barely put his finger on. It was something quite like jealousy, but almost as if he was jealous for someone other than himself. He could imagine someone seeing him and being jealous, and he knew they would be wrong. He was jealous for the kind of gnome who lucked into happiness, a gnome like Keppo or his sister Haida, but he didn't mistake either as being happy. Even now, at this meal, they just looked anxious. The feeling Spliff was having was like jealousy for the concept that being jealous might put pep in his step. Jealousy for the idea that anything ever had meaning for anyone. Put in more simple terms, he was depressed. He was drinking, languidly but with purpose. He was barely paying attention to what was happening around him. It didn't feel like it mattered if he was here or not, alive or not. The questions had evaporated, and what he was left with was the side effect of his personality, which doubted everything, questions included. It took a minute for him to realize Francis had sat across from him and was trying to subtly get his attention. When he finally had Spliff's attention, the gnome just stared back at Francis with a blank expression, and the Druid knew he'd have to go to him. As he stood, Pofime touched his arm. "Where are you going? You just got here." No excuse came readily to mind, and the touch froze Francis. He sat back down and looked deeply into Pofime's smiling face. He touched her hand with his hand, and then she drew it back and poured him a glass of wine from the decanter. She called down towards Falcior to pass her some duck. "You must try this duck. It's adored by the court," she said. Francis had been lightheaded and hungry. There was no rush. He took the food with a gratitude which was both genuine and fake. He realized Pofime was accustomed to subservience, and if he tapped into his reserve of patience, it might give him an advantage. She had him, but he still had his own terms. Mainly, that there was a lot less to be had than she might have presumed. Her ego suspected he also had an ego of considerable gravity, and perhaps he did, but it was an ego which had lived side by side with plants, ingested wind, and felt the sizzle of the sun like a heartbeat on his skin. He could manipulate his feelings along with the sense of himself. She had less of a hold on him than she assumed. As the next course was brought in, Falcior stood to make a toast. "We have all spent the last week celebrating the accomplishments made so far." He took a pause, looking regal in his jacket trimmed with gold. "But this dinner is an anniversary for the proof that the things to come are grand, and even better days still await." Falcior held up his glass and drank and sat. Across the table, Spliff audibly guffawed among the cheers, and Francis realized he didn't have all the time he wanted. What had happened to Spliff's paranoid self-protection? A gnome in a robe also trimmed with gold like Falcior's, sitting next to Pofime, began engaging her in conversation. "My family has every set of original arms and armor, which came out of the first furnaces of Ionata," he proclaimed, a little drunkenly. He continued, "What they are worth now is uncalculable. It's a shame there's nothing likewise to collect from Ionic resonance. Does our lord not have something from the construction?" the gnome asked Pofime. Pofime demurred dramatically, saying to her knowledge she knew of no such artifacts. "In fact, is that not the point?" she asked playfully, motioning at the lights glittering in the ceiling. She continued, "The resonance is now ordinary as a horseshoe, but I'm sure your armor is beautiful." "Oh, 'tis, the rich gnome agreed. He motioned at Francis and asked about his station. Pofime explained before Francis could respond that he was a druid. "And what do you think of our progress, Master Druid?" the gnome asked with an air of pretentious rhetoric, as if the question answered itself. Francis had not thought about the word progress in a long time. The idea seemed a distant sense of himself, the man who believed in progress. If he believed in anything, he had belief in cycles. Progress meant a way of doing things which was continually better and better. Such an idea extrapolated into the best. Progress meant there was some version of life which was the best life. Was it best to be a beetle or a ladybug, a rose or a lilac, a plum tree or an apple tree? Progress, if he could understand it as meaning anything, to Francis meant variety. And other people's versions of progress meant eliminating variety. Get a spider bite? Well, let's kill all the spiders then. He had not answered the question, and Pofime was giving him a queer sidelong look. He cleared his throat. We'll see. Francis took another bite of duck. Pofime neither scowled or smiled, watched him as if he were a stag who was grazing in the field you neither wanted to spook or get upset. It felt good. It felt like the way he always wanted to be looked at. The gnome in the gold-trimmed robe started speaking in Gnomish to the gnome beside him. Francis again tried to see if he could catch Spliff's eye. They exchanged looks over the gap. What Spliff couldn't get out of his head was a repeating thought. Maybe I'm the villain. Maybe I'm the villain. What I ran away from is the consequences of my thoughts. There's something broken in me. Spliff was feeling antagonistic. He was prepared to do something stupid. If he couldn't be smart, might as well be stupid. Francis felt all of this across the tables. He needed to get over there. But wait, how did he feel it? He second-guessed himself. Patience was the name of the game. Eat more food, drink the wine, find himself. Then, maybe, there would be an obvious moment. And such a moment came. It was not obvious at first. The envoy, breathless at the top of the stairs, walking in quickly, followed by two tough-looking human guards, obviously not from Falcior's personal brigade. The envoy walked a step into the U of the table and proclaimed, "I bring a message from King Namnastine." The envoy looked back over his shoulder at the two leather-clad guards, did a tiny little squeal and ran further into the tables and dropped to his knees and clambered between the diner's legs. "Oh, you little shit," one of the burly humans said and rushed into the U, trying to grab the envoy. The tables burst into chaos as drinks were spilled and guests shot up from their seats. Even Falcior was stunned. Francis, mid-sip of wine, chugged the rest of his glass. Chapter 5.5 hours earlier, the Black Bear Inn. Calumny had employed a covert group to watch entrees into the city and the mountain. The impatience of his men had become impossible to ignore or quell. One might argue Calumny's rough exterior manifested from an excess of feeling, not from a lack. He could feel his authority slipping. He needed authority. Authority was the only thing which brought him temporary peace from his feelings. It was how he convinced himself he was in control, when so often his feelings would have him believe the whole world was out to get him, and he might be killed at any moment. His mother had been a self-proclaimed witch. She was cruel. Calumny had slept on the hard dirt floor of their shack until he was 9 years old, and only then he'd gotten a thin reed mat a neighbor was throwing out and refurbished himself. His mother had no time for him. She had grander metaphysical pursuits, though her witchy powers were not merely delusion. He'd walked into their house one day to find her levitating, her hair weightless, floating around her head. He'd broken her concentration, and she screamed at him to leave immediately after she thumped to the floor. He was scared of her. When she'd stolen the coin he'd earned from working in the fields, he'd decided to be done with her for good, but the stain she left on his psyche could never be removed. After all, he'd seen the magic with his own eyes. Calumny was playing cards at his usual table inside the inn. One of his men entered with his arm around the shoulders of an uncomfortable-looking and snappily dressed young person. He looked like he was from the capital. His man winked at Calumny, and Calumny nodded at the others he was playing cards with, who stood and surrounded the young envoy. The envoy was given a mug of beer and then directed by the gang to sit down across from Calumny. Calumny looked over his shoulder, and one of his men brought him a mug of beer as well. "You have nothing to fear," he said to the obviously anxious young envoy. "We're just, how would you say in the capital, the welcome party." His men chuckled stupidly. The young envoy did and said nothing. "State your business and we'll get you back on your way." Calumny sipped his beer and put an elbow on the back of his chair, waiting. The young envoy was too scared to lie. "I bring a message from the king for Lord Falcior." Good. We'd been hoping for good news." Again, Calumny waited. "So, out with it, boy. What's the message?" I don't know," the envoy stammered. He went into his small satchel and withdrew a sealed letter. It would be a magic seal, and known if it was tampered with. Calumny was sick of sitting on his ass. He needed to stir the pot somehow. "You see, we have found out that our Lord Falcior doesn't always deliver what he promises, and we think maybe the king should know about that." The young envoy nodded his head vigorously. He could agree to that. He understood delivering messages. He cleared his throat. "Do you have a letter? I'll be back on the road in the morning. You could compose it this eve if you wished." "See, I'd like to trust you. You seem like a good kid, but the king has no reason to read a letter from me," Calumny said. "Oh no, he's very diligent," Calumny cut off the envoy. "Lord Falcior, on the other hand, he doesn't even bother to take the hour and come down and check on us. If you're going up there anyway, maybe you could give him a message from us." "Why not go up yourselves?" the envoy asked. Well, the last time I was at one of those fancy parties. Should I tell him the story, boys?" Calumny swiveled on his bench to receive the hoots and grins of his goons. "You see, they have these orgies, and some of those little gnomes are so pretty they'll trick you. One of 'em takes me in the back and is just slobbering on my big prick, saying they never seen one so big. And I'm getting pretty hot, when I want to see what it looks like downstairs. So I grab it and pick it up and rip off the leggings, and by God, if the thing didn't have a little prick. But I was still pretty hot, so I decided, hell, I'll pull out my knife and make a hole anyway." Calumny turned to his men again, everyone grinning and cackling. The young envoy was red, even sweating a little. He drank some beer to replenish his fluids. "Oh, I'm just messing with you, boy." Calumny rapidly stuck his knife into the table. "But I'll tell you the truth. A prick is awfully easy to cut off." Calumny stood up, went to the bar, and got a shot of rock-gut liquor. He faced the envoy standing. "You see, we thought we'd be drinking wine by now. But they're hoarding all the best." Calumny took the shot, hoping it would inspire him into a plan. What if he just got the kid to tell everyone at the party what was actually happening? That would stir things up. Falcior'd have to take them seriously then. He could manage all them little gnomes, keep 'em complacent. "I want you to tell Falcior a message from us in front of everybody. Announce yourself. Hell, you know what? Better yet, you tell him the message is from the king. You tell him the king sends his regards. They just finished their own ionic resonance machine and thank him for the plans. You think you can manage that?" The envoy nodded. He would have agreed to anything. "Say it nice and loud," one of the goons chipped in. Not really sure he understood the plan at all, but being hard of hearing after years in the mines, often felt left out in cacophonous conversation. Calumny liked this attitude and tasked the goon and a buddy of his choosing to follow the envoy. "I want you to tell me what Falzior's face looked like after he hears," Calumny said with a serious smirk, his chubby face not without charm. After all, one of his tasks had been making his mother laugh when she was in one of those moods.